welcome to part 2. Are you interested in speeding up the recovery time and boosting the effects of all those positive benefits? Well, if so, this is the video for you. Now, I said in part 1 that we are going to talk about cold showers today, but I'm going to give you something much more and much better here. I'm going to share a short excerpt from an online course presentation I did about dopamine fasting, which, by the way, dopamine fasting is also a tool that can speed up recovery time. But anyway, I'm sharing this presentation with you because it will show you first the process of how supernormal stimuli, like watching a lot of porn, downregulates the dopamine system, but then also what you can do to reverse it. And we are going to understand that by looking at a super interesting graph. And then after that, we can start zooming in on different tools and tactics one by one, like for example cold showers and so on. So even if some of you may recognize the concept I talk about in the first half of the presentation, please watch it all. Watch it to the end, because I'm telling you it will be life-changing information for you, and you will be getting one aha moment after the other. So get rid of all the distractions now and do your best to stay to the end here, because this is well worth your time. Okay, here comes the presentation. Alright, so we are back on the animation board, and now we are going to take a look at the desensitization process. In other words, what can happen if you keep overusing instant gratification, super stimulating things. So what you are looking at here is a part of the dopamine system in action. To the left we have the sending neuron, and to the right the receiving neuron. See those small dots there? Well, that is our friend dopamine right there. And dopamine does its magic by attaching to the small dopamine receptors here, the small slots that the dopamine molecules fit perfectly into. And when dopamine has parked into those, it is then we feel the effects of dopamine. Now, what happens if we expose our brain to very stimulating things is that the brain starts going, oh no, now there's too much dopamine here. I need to protect myself from it. And it does so by reducing the number of dopamine receptors, as you can see on the animation eraser right now. And the thing is, with less dopamine receptors, those small dopamine molecules now have less slots to park into, which means we feel less effects of whatever dopamine a certain activity gives us. Just a short example here. Let's say that a certain activity gives you a certain amount of fun and pleasure. And let's just, for the sake of this example, come up with a unit for that fun and pleasure. Let's call the unit FN, as in, fun. Okay, so then let's say that every Wednesday night you have band practice where you play your musical instrument. And that activity is giving you, let's say, 56 FN. Well, if you desensitize your reward system by, for example, watching way too much porn, now when you go to your band practice, even though the sending neuron is sending you 56 FN, it will only feel like maybe 39 FN, because you now have less of those small dopamine receptors. And the scary part here is a receptor, meaning this feeling less effects of dopamine is now gonna be true for every single activity you do. Every single activity, not just music or porn or whatever, but every single activity. This is the neurobiological process behind desensitization, also known as getting a numb pleasure response or a disrupted dopamine system. Alright, so you have just learned what the desensitization process looks like inside your brain on a neurobiological level. And I want to point out that this process does not happen from normal, healthy activities, even though they too release dopamine. Things like eating a healthy meal, listening to music, playing music, singing, dancing, socializing, physical exercise, and so on, unless you go really, really crazy with them. No, desensitization happens 99% of the time from low-value dopamine activities. Instant gratification stuff that bring you a lot of pleasure without you having to put in any effort first. And even then, it doesn't happen instantly. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens with repeated exposures over time, depending a bit on how potent that low-value dopamine activity is, of course. Now, the nasty thing here is that those small dopamine receptors, they do not grow back right away whenever you stop doing whatever thing that desensitized you. No, those receptors need time in order to upregulate. But the good news is they will and they can upregulate. And this, ladies and gentlemen, this is where dopamine fasting enters the picture. Now, should any one of you still be a bit uncertain about just exactly what is a dopamine fast, then here's my definition of it. A dopamine fast is simply a period of time where you deprive yourself of stimulating things or you reduce the amount of them in order to help your brain reset the dopamine system. And you do this so that you can be more excited about life again, and so you can improve your concentration and your focus, get more motivation and drive. You will basically be able to enjoy life more again. And also, should you have ADHD-like tendencies caused by too much and too rapid online distractions, well, then that will reverse as well. Now, you do not need to, nor should you try to remove everything that releases dopamine during a dopamine fast. Things like, for example, physical exercise or taking a cold shower. Well, these are high-value dopamine activities because there's no dopamine crash after you have been doing those. So they do not desensitize you. In fact, they might even be able to help speed up your recovery. More on that in just a moment here. Now, I have to point out that the dopamine system is pretty complex, and the picture you're looking at right now, and that you also saw a few minutes ago in the previous lesson, well, the explanation there was a bit simplistic. For example, in addictions, the sending nerve cell can also start sending less signals, while you at the same time also have less dopamine receptors. And then it really becomes a double whammy, obviously, with really low dopamine functioning. Let's take a look at something else here. Remember when I just told you that desensitization doesn't happen instantly, but it's only if you keep doing those low-value dopamine activities many times over and over again. This is a graph that will show you exactly that. This graph is also known as Richard Solomon's opponent process theory, and it's now obviously more than just a theory. But anyway, as you can see, we have A process to the left and then we have a B process to the right. So then the y-axis here is how you're feeling. The higher up on the y-axis, the better you feel, and then the lower down we go here, the worse you feel. And then here in the middle is your baseline level of pleasure, happiness, or awesomeness, or whatever the heck we want to call it. And before I continue here, I'm going to give you a phrase to remember for later on. And the cool thing here is that this graph is actually pretty old, but recent studies have found that it is really super accurate, because brain scientists have now found that pain and pleasure are co-located in the brain. If you push on one of them, the other one will respond. And this is the phrase I want you to remember. Pain and pleasure are co-located in the brain. Keep that in mind as we are going to come back to that in a moment. Okay, so let's take a look at the graph here. When we present a stimulus to the body, let's take alcohol as the first example. This is what's going to happen. The pleasure curve starts rising sharply, immediately. And what we are engaging in here is a so-called low-value dopamine activity, by the way. And as most of you already know, a lot of people feel really good right here. You feel more relaxed and more euphoric, and you have quite a lot of dopamine. You sail up here way above your baseline. Engaging in this activity is the A process in Richard Solomon's graph. Now, another thing to realize here is that the brain does not like extreme things. It likes to maintain homeostasis, so it doesn't like sharp changes in the baseline level. This means that whenever a powerful stimuli pushes the baseline, the brain immediately kicks in a counter mechanism. So you adapt pretty quickly and go down here, and after a few more hours you really go down even further, even below your baseline levels. This counteraction process is the B process in the Richard Solomon's graph. And down here you are not feeling well. It doesn't feel good at all, and perhaps many of you can relate as you're thinking back about how you used to feel the day after a heavy night's drinking session. And here I really need to point out that drinking alcohol is just one example here. That rebound effect will occur with pretty much all potent instant gratifications you can find out there, not just alcohol. Now here comes something interesting, so pay attention now. Notice that it says first few stimulations up here. Well, this means that this slump down here is just a temporary rebound effect of your dopamine levels, and you will slowly start feeling better as you manage to get back up to baseline after a few hours or a day or so. However, let's now go to the next lesson, where I will show you how this graph will start to change after repeated exposures. And you do not want to miss this, because in a moment you will get a big aha moment when you start realizing something really fascinating here. Alright, so as you remember, the graph we were just looking at in the last lesson showed what the rebound effect in dopamine looks like after engaging in just a few stimulations. This was the graph we were looking at then. Well, now let's take a look at what that graph will look like after many stimulations. And as you can see, now the graph has changed. Now that you've been doing the instant gratification activity repeatedly over and over again, now you are actually desensitized. And when you look at the graph here, now you can see that desensitization, because now you get less enjoyment and pleasure from the stimuli. And then even worse, the B process gets even longer and deeper than previously. And worst of all, when you start to recover from your alcohol binge after a day or two, you no longer reach up to your former baseline here. Can you see that? So now you are stuck below your former baseline. In other words, you have now permanently changed your set point so that you have lower levels of motivation, happiness, and awesomeness. Well, permanently is perhaps not the best word, because you can reverse it by getting away from all that low value dopamine stimulation for a while. But if you ignore doing that and you just keep blasting your brain with more low value dopamine stimulation, well then it's permanent. Because as you can see, you are stuck here under your former baseline. And it's possible to keep digging the hole deeper and deeper. So now I'm sure more and more of you start to understand how valuable dopamine fasting will be to help reverse your disrupted dopamine system, and how incredibly useful it's going to be for you to take a short break from the most stimulating stuff. And here comes a twist that almost no one talks about on YouTube. They only talk about doing a dopamine fast to quote-unquote reset the dopamine system by removing stimulating things. But then what 99% of them miss is that you can actually flip the Richard Solomon's graph to help speed up the resetting process. Yes, we can turn everything upside down to speed up the growth of new D2 receptors. Check this out, because this is so cool. If we go back to the first graph here, remember when I said that your brain doesn't like extreme things and that it wants to maintain homeostasis? Well, this means that the graph works the other way around as well. Now look here. If we go to the y-axis and we flip the emotions here and we put the pain and effort up here, and then we put the pleasure and happiness down here. Okay, great. So if we now present the brain with a stimulus that is quite painful or takes quite a lot of effort, like for example going for a fast 30-minute run, you will feel pain in the moment. Pain is now the stimulation, so pain is now the A process here. But then the counter mechanism, which is the B process, kicks in after you're done. So then you'll actually start feeling really good. Because again, in terms of feelings, this is now the good side of the line. This is what I like to call a high value dopamine activity, because you get lasting dopamine levels that don't drop your baseline levels in the long run. In fact, it is the very opposite of an addiction. And here comes the coolest part of everything so far. This is just so fascinating. Remember the first few stimulations line here. And remember how the graph will change after many stimulations. This one here. Well, the coolest thing here is that the second graph now also works when we have flipped the y-axis. So the more often you do stuff that takes effort and are a bit painful, like for example running hard for 20 minutes, doing heavy squats, or doing intermittent fasting, taking cold showers, and on and on and on, all those effortful things, the more often you do those, the less painful they will start to feel in the moment. And the cool part here is that after you're done, when the B process kicks in, you will now feel even more pleasure and enjoyment after you're done. Yeah, because remember, the B process always becomes deeper and stronger and longer after we have been logging in ongoing repeated stimulations, no matter which way you flip the y-axis. But hands down, the absolute best part about the repeated stimulations after flipping the y-axis is that when the B process finally comes to an end, you remain on this side of the baseline, which is now the happiness and pleasure side. Can you see it? You have now permanently changed your pleasure thermostat to a new set point, a better set point this time, as you are now on the right side of the pain and pleasure axis. Now, just how cool is this? This is literally the exact opposite of the addiction and desensitization process, showing how you can permanently create a new baseline level of happiness, drive, and motivation, as you can see in the picture right here. And since pain and pleasure are co-located in the brain, in other words, if you push on one side, the other side counteracts, that means you now also have a lower baseline level of pain. Or perhaps a better way to put this is, you are now a dude walking around feeling more happy with yourself and your life, while you at the same time have a much higher pain threshold. Now, just how badass is that? You are suddenly happier, more awesome, and on top of that you now also have a higher pain tolerance. Does this make sense to you? Well, I hope it does, because it's so cool. And the final benefit here, not only can this help reverse desensitization, which it does, but by adding a bit of painful stuff into your fasts, you can actually grow more receptors than what you had even before you started using those instant gratification stimulations. Even more than what quote-unquote normal people have who are not desensitized. Yeah, that's right. You can reach levels that are higher than what people are on who never ever used any supernormal stimuli in the first place. That's so freaking amazing. And this is where I got the term quote-unquote supercharge your dopamine system from. Because if you can get your dopamine system in a way better shape than a normal functioning brain, oh man, supercharging is not a stupid term at all. In fact, it is quite appropriate. Now, isn't this exciting? Okay, so that was just a short excerpt from my course, and let's jump back to our current video now. Now, wasn't that interesting? And you should know, when you change your set point in a positive way like that you just saw in the later part of that graph, well, you should know that you are also then significantly speeding up the recovery of your brain after an addiction. And now, when you understand all of this, it's going to be so easy for us to continue our series with zooming in on one tool at a time, and exactly how I myself and many of my clients are using these tools. But this video is already getting too long, so in part 3 we will continue with this, and then we'll start looking at different interesting tools. So if you have had a history of porn use and or are doing nofap, make sure to subscribe for that. And speaking of recovery time, if you want to know how long recovery will take on average for someone with your history and circumstances, well, you can learn how to figure that out by clicking on the video you see to the left right here, and click on the video to the right here to continue to part 3 in this series about how to recover and speed things up. And if you can't see any video to the right, it just means I'm still working on it, and it will be out real soon.